From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Iraq and Iran. The political crisis in Iraq following the recent resignation of Prime Minister Adel Mahdi, the protest movements that have rocked both countries, and the impact of Iranian influence in Baghdad on Iraq's trajectory going forward. To discuss the situation, I'm joined today by two great guests, Hafsa Halawa and Alex Vatanka. Hafsa is an independent consultant working on political, social, and economic affairs and development goals across the Middle East, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa. Alex is an Iran expert and senior fellow here at MEI. Hafsa, Alex, thank you both for joining me today, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you, Alistair.
Hafsa, I wanted to start with you and the resignation of Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi. It was announced last Friday, approved by legislators on Sunday. Where do things stand now, and what's your read on where they're headed?
So I think really the situation actually remains quite unchanged from where we've been in the last few weeks in terms of the dynamic between the protesters and the strength of the protests across most of the southern provinces and the government. The government has, for weeks now, decided, or the political elite, we should say, have decided to entrench themselves. They've given themselves the opportunity to stay this out and run the course and hope that the protests die down. And really, the resignation has come in response to both, obviously, the reference Adel Mahdi himself made in his resignation letter to the Friday sermon speech given by Ayatollah Sistani, but also, I think, in terms of the response to such violence that we saw in the days leading up to the protests, particularly in Nasiriyah and Najaf. So where we stand, I mean, if you want to be pedantic about it, the constitution in Iraq doesn't really provide a way through for this kind of situation in terms of the prime minister's resignation and so on. Obviously, Parliament has decided to bypass that little issue, as we've seen in the past, which has been quite detrimental to Iraq's own progression and transition to democracy. But where the situation now lies, I mean, in terms of practicality, the prime minister or the government is still a functioning caretaker government. There is now debate over whether the decision to call on forming a new parliament lies with the president, Barham Saleh, or with parliament in terms of the speaker calling on the largest bloc and so on and so forth. And there is continued debate over who the largest bloc is, not just in terms of the elections last year, but also in terms of historical constitutional decisions made in the wake of sort of 2010. So in terms of the actual practicality, it's a real quagmire of what happens now. Obviously, there has been a decision to move forward in terms of the acceptance that Adel Mahdi's term has come to an end and that he cannot ride this out himself. So the question really is, who can survive in the next government? Who will be the consensus candidate that can be agreed on? There's already tussling between the largest blocs in parliament over who gets to choose. What is the role Sistani has? I mean, in that kind of scenario, or in those kind of questions, we're really where we were 2-3 weeks ago. Very little in terms of the substance of what happens now has changed. And that's primarily to give credit to them because the protesters have neither dwindled in number or strength or in demand. And ultimately, that demand is accountability for a wide range of issues, not least the violence of the last 4 to 8 weeks that have seen so many innocent people lose their lives and be injured.
On the issue of the next prime minister, do you have a sense of who any of the kind of leading names under consideration are? And are any of them likely to be a sort of a game changer for the protesters?
Well, I certainly am not going to be the person who puts their neck on the line and fathoms a guess at names at this point in time. It's very difficult to sort of see a name that can satisfy the political elite and also satisfy the protest. And that's really the core of what we're talking about here, because the protest movement itself has inadvertently in its core demand a desire to upend the political order, to really, and unlike other uprisings, this is not about one dictator, one autocrat, one movement. It is a plethora of political actors who have been in and out of power and entrenching themselves in the system since 2003. So it's really everybody, which makes it really difficult. I mean, you have in the last couple of days, so the 2 or 3 days since the resignation was officially announced and accepted, Muqtada Sadr has come out and sort of said the street will choose, the protesters will choose. And there's a lot of laughing that off. You know, there's a lot of sort of saying, oh, but it's completely impractical. And how on earth can the protesters choose a candidate and so on and so forth? It's not beyond the realm of possibility that it could be pulled off. The question is, what kind of government formation would satisfy them? And they've been very clear in their demands. They want a technocratic government that would preside over a transitional period until new elections are held, with the condition that nobody in this transitional government would run for any kind of office in the new elections, or would so really try and getting a non-partisan, non-political kind of moment where a government could form and oversee a transition with new electoral laws and so on and so forth. And the main sticking block to that, as good an idea as it may sound in principle, is the political elite themselves. I mean, who is going to have the political courage within the system to either come out and take on the job with the conditions that they put towards it, and then stick to those conditions, because we've seen in the past quite good guys, shall we say, for lack of a better phrase, who get caught up in the corruption and the cycles and so forth and never really manage to break free of the shackles of this post-2003 political order. So it's really difficult to see what names would satisfy the protesters, although I do imagine some names we have seen over the last 16 years who still have modicums of respect generally will be the most likely people that are put forward within the next few weeks as this process plays out.
I wanted to ask as well, Hafsa, about the kind of violence involved in putting down some of these protests so far. Hundreds of people have been killed. Thousands of people have been injured. Reports suggest that the government will be prosecuting dozens of police officers for their role in all of this. But I'm wondering what your kind of read on this is, and if you think we're likely to see broader changes within the police and security forces as a result of this.
So, I mean, that's that's a sort of two-pronged question, because it comes down to the formal security sector and security sector reform in the formal sense, and of course the elephant in the room, which is the informal non-state armed actors, primarily the PMUs or the Hashd Shabi. And those are two very different questions. I mean, let's be frank, the last 4 weeks have been particularly violent, with 450 plus people killed. But let's not forget the period of October 1st until mid-October, when a similar number also lost their lives. I mean, the violent response has been really immediate. There's been no build-up to this. The minute people took to the streets, they were responded to violently. And some of the injuries have been life-destroying, if not, completely life-threatening in themselves. And we have seen a complete reluctance from the government, from senior security actors, to respond to calls for accountability. And they've really, to be frank, try to weather this storm and ride it out. And what we're seeing in these piecemeal attempts of accountability is to try and quieten the street. I think there's a lot of underestimating of the protest movement, its diversity, its strength. Really, the scenes we saw across Sunday, across the entire country, hundreds of thousands of people in black, mourning across, and it wasn't just contained to the south. It grew and spread to northern provinces. We're seeing university protests. So the protest movement is getting younger. It's more rejectionist. It's angrier. And this is an attempt to really shut it down, shut down the calls for accountability, give them 10, 12, 15, 20 officers that we can sacrifice. But and it comes back to the political question as well, because of how entrenched armed non-state actors are in the political system, is how much they will fight to hold on to what they have earned in the last 16 years. And that confrontation with the protests will continue, quite simply because the protesters aren't going away. It's not for lack of the the political elite and the security sector attempting to put it down.
Alex, I'm keen to get your perspective here as well. How has the government in Tehran reacted to Abdul Mahdi's resignation?
If you look at the news coming out of Tehran the last few days, it's one of being nervous, but I don't sense any panic. I think, any kinds of change obviously could result in outcomes that from Tehran's perspective might be unwanted. Certainly a place like Iraq that from Iranian foreign policy perspective has been one of the more success stories of the last, certainly 20 years or so. The fear, which would have resulted in panic, which we haven't seen, is that they lost the gains in Iraq. I don't sense that. What I do sense is early on, the Iranian regime certainly felt that earlier the protests in Iraq were put down better in the second round, the ones that happened in the month of November, because it coincided with the protests in Iran. So you could see a linkage and a fear that was happening in Iraq and earlier in Lebanon, to some extent continuing in Lebanon, that this would have an impact of mobilizing the Iranian certain youth, the protesters that were in the streets. I don't know the level of connectivity or in terms of impact of protests in Iraq and Syria on mobilization by protesters in Iran. I don't see much evidence of it. But one could make the argument that the Iranian security forces are learning the lessons from their counterparts in Iraq, because in the history of the Islamic Republic, they have never come out and killed so many people in so few days, such a short period of time, the way they did this last time. I mean, we still don't know how many people the Iranian security forces have killed, but it's nothing like we've seen before, which raises the question, are they learning lessons from next door in Iraq, as we just heard from Hafsa? Hundreds, thousands, hundreds have been killed, thousands arrested. Exactly the same thing was replicated on the Iranian side. But in terms of the bigger picture, the Iranians are not panicking because, conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C. tells us Iran has only allies among the Shias and certain Shias. The reality, I think, is that Iran has more cards to play, including the Kurds, probably more than just a handful of militia Shia leaders, and probably some Sunni allies too. In other words, the lack of panic in Tehran with the departure of Adel Abdul Mahdi is that somebody else can come in and we can still work with him because we are so present on all levels in Iraqi society today that it's so hard to dislodge us. That might be true. I don't know that, but that certainly seems to be their reading. One final point I make about the bigger kind of where is Iraq going forward. The fact that a cleric, or by the very senior cleric in this case, Ayatollah Sistani, seems to have had the final say about the future of a prime minister. Anybody in the Middle East who looks at this and believes in genuine democracy has only reason to be disheartened. Now, I'm not saying this to say anything bad about Ayatollah Sistani. I'm sure he's a wonderful, learned religious scholar. But the fact is, he wasn't elected to the office he's in. And in Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is not elected to the office he's in. So what we are dealing with here, which is sort of the root causes of so much that's going on, it's about accountability, transparency. There is no such thing as Islamic democracy. It's a fallacy. It doesn't exist. You either have democracy or you have something different. And I think, one would hope as the Iraqi people struggle forward that they would come up with something better than having to have someone deliver sermon on behalf of a grand ayatollah that then seals the fate of a political figurehead. That is one of the lessons I think a lot of folks in Iran are trying to sort of get their heads around. The reality is also that the Iraqi model has been influenced greatly, not just by what the U.S. put together after 2003 with the sort of emphasis on division of power based on sect, but also from what the Iraqis have been able to witness next door in Iran, in around the idea of the supreme leadership concept, which is, In the case of Iran, it's pure theocracy. In the case of Iraq, you could make the argument that it's more democracy, but elements of theocracy in it. Going forward, the fear among Democrats is, will the theocratic part in this Iraqi system get bigger going forward? Or with it, as I suspect the protesters want, be smaller going forward? So then you end up with more transparency and accountability, and people's voices be heard better.
I'm curious also, too, how much about is built into the system versus just the kind of unique character of Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani and the kind of role that he plays in Iraqi political life. Hafsa, maybe you could kind of comment on that. I'm curious just to get your read on his kind of role in this whole dynamic.
Sure, thanks. With all respect to Alex, I slightly disagree on some of the points. I think that part of what we're seeing is, I wouldn't call it, I agree with him, I don't think there's panic on the part of the Iranians as yet. But in the last, I would say, 10, 12 days, as protests have targeted specific sort of bastions of Iranian foreign policy. I think the burning of the consulate in Najaf the day before Abdul Mahdi submitted his resignation, there are certain signs that at least of worry, shall we say, for the Iranians. And building on Alex's point, having invested so much in this political order in Iraq, we always, we like to talk from Washington a lot about how much the US has invested, both in obviously in the military side, but always also in the political and the transformation, the transition to democracy. There is a similar investment on that part of the Iranians, and the fact that the targets, as anger develops, because you do have, and we've had a series of cases of, masked militiamen, unidentified masked men who are actively killing protesters, and there are conspiracy theories or shall we say suggestions from both sides about who is responsible. There is at least a general sentiment within the protest movement that Iran is trying to influence a more violent response from the security forces, and it hasn't been as well countered as it could have been or should have been by the government if in fact there's no truth to it. And just on the question of Sistani, I think there is a lot of this idea that Sistani kind of rules the political order in the country. And there is some merit to that. I mean, we talk about the Prime Minister alluded to the sermon in his resignation letter to Parliament, but I do genuinely think it was more about the violence that we'd seen in the 48 hours leading up to it, to have more than 60 people killed in the space of 24 hours in such violent circumstances. We had similar questions a couple of weeks before that after a questionable night of violence in Karbala earlier in the month in November. So this is something that the Prime Minister has been dodging for weeks now, and obviously it just reached a point where he couldn't. But to give, the Ayatollah, it's not about, I think, democracy and transparency in that sense when it comes to how the people view Ayatollah Sistani and how they look towards him. He is somebody revered, shall we say, within the Iraqi political elite as the most clean. So when the protesters look to him, it's because of all the research I've certainly done and all of the things that I've learned in Iraq. It's because the people trust him or the marja'iyya the most. And there are questions about whether that's the man or the religious house, and there's a lot of debate about that itself. But the reality is that Iraq has become so corrupt. Whatever side you're on, whatever political party you have or haven't supported or voted for in the past, there is, corruption is so much an entrenched part of this post-2003 order that the marja'iyya and Ayatollah Sistani are really seen as the last sort of bastion of where they can trust in the institution. And the fact that you've had continuous support from Ayatollah Sistani for the protests, and I mean material support, as well as the Friday sermons we've had, we've seen money and support and first aid and all kinds of things. There is a genuine belief that the religious sort of house, shall we say, in Iraq is behind the good and against the bad. And it can be broken down to be that simple. Obviously, in reality, it's much more complicated than that when you bring in Iran and the theocracy and so on. But just to sort of make that short point.
No, I think, it was wonderful to hear Hafsa give us more detail, but she also at the same time described the failure of the political system. Inherently, it has failed.
Yes.
And if you have, clerics unelected being the best hopes of the people, and those clerics can all be as clean as they can be, but that's not a democracy. That's still a theocracy, a benign theocracy, but it's still a theocracy. And we have to call it what it is. Iraqi theocracy going forward might be different than more malign Iranian theocracy, but they're both theocracies. That was certainly not the intention of the Bush presidency in 2003 when they went into Iraq. So I think, I don't want to get into what's going on in Iraq. That is for Iraq experts to comment on. Hafsa's doing a wonderful job telling us about what's going on. But I tell you, from a regional perspective, those of us who really genuinely still hope that this young part of the world can do better, can deliver so much more for its people, for its young, so they don't have to get on the next bus or bicycle and get to Europe for looking for a future, that there will be going forward in Iraq positive news coming out of that country one way or another that would help those with hopes and aspirations for democracy to take hold in the Middle East, to look at Iraq as an example of genuine democracy and democratic practices being exercised. So that's all I wanted to say on that.
We're running a little short on time here, but there's one final question before we wrap up for both of you, I guess. Curious to get your thoughts on whether you think that Iran's influence in Iraqi politics, probably best exemplified by the figure of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Revolutionary Guards Quds Force, will that be affected by the protest movement? Has it been already? What's your kind of take on that?
Look, I would say this. When news reports come out that Qasem Soleimani, early on when the protests began in Iraq, flies in a helicopter into the green zone in Baghdad to take part in an emergency meeting of senior Iraqi leadership, as it was reported, that to me could be interpreted by some as, oh my God, Iran has such clout. I would look at it as Iranian overreach. I don't think Iran has the capacity to be involved in Iraq in the longer term to the extent that they have been, unless they want to control Iraq, if you will. And I don't think they have the capacity to do it. Look, historically, Iraq was a good neighbor of Iran till the monarchy fell. The Republican system that followed had troubles, as we know, with the Shah. And then we had the Iran-Iraq war, and then 2003 happened, and the Iranians were able to manage to shift or to engineer, if you will, Iraq's political future in a certain way that has been to their benefit. So no, look, end of the day, what Iran has to figure out in Tehran is what kind of a foreign policy do they want? Do they want to keep Iraq as a neighbor that's not a security threat the way Iraq was under Saddam Hussein, that's as a market where they can sell goods and buy goods, have healthy neighborly commercial ties, and perhaps even a diplomatic ally on key issues in the region? That I would describe as sort of conventional interstate relations, which would be very good, hard to argue against. But if Iran wants to export its political system to Iraq, if Iran insists on making sure that the proxies in Iraq become what Revolutionary Guards is in Iran today, then I think it complicates it, not just for the Iraqi people, but it also complicates it for many back in Iran, because Iran's so-called interventions in the Arab world are not exactly cheap. There's a heavy price tag you have to pay in terms of financial resources you have to invest. And we saw in Syria, in terms of people you have to commit that potentially die. So it's a question they have to answer for themselves. What kind of foreign policy do they want? They have a fancy term for it in Tehran. They call it forward defense. So if you want to fight your enemies, do it outside Iran's borders. It's better that way. But it's not always that easy. And I think forward defense going forward, in my humble opinion, will be too costly to be sustained. Iran would be better off looking to remain a key player in Iraqi foreign policy, but not the kind of dominant player where Qasem Soleimani flies into the green zone in a helicopter and decides the fate of the country. That's not good for Iraq, certainly not good for Iran.
Hafsa, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think actually in the coming few sort of weeks, months, maybe longer, this question of Iran's overreach, not just in Iraq over the last 16 years, but across the region more broadly, is going to become something that requires much more attention, particularly obviously with the protest movements in Lebanon, Iraq, and also inside Iran, but also the Syria policy and the legacy of the Syria policy. With Iraq, I think it's very complicated. I mean, I think there needs to be a level of acknowledgement of Iran's, I wouldn't call it influence, but relationship in Iraq. It's undeniable, the kind of relationship that Iran has built over the last, let's say, decade. We can't deny the engagement with groups, whether they be the political arm of armed state, non-state actors like the Hashd al-Shabi or otherwise. But Iraq, I think, in some ways has proven itself a liability to Iranian foreign policy in the sense that it hasn't played ball because Iraq isn't that kind of country. And maybe on a larger scale than what's developed in Lebanon over the last 2 or 3 decades, Iraq has proven itself to be a much more complicated landscape to navigate for the Iranians. And whether or not the type of influence they at least would like to project that they have in the country is sustainable is something, agreeing with Alex, that I think is really going to come into question. And on that point, across the board, I think it's because there has been a genuine underestimating of what these young Iraqis not only are in the streets demanding, but what they truly want. You know, it's something, having looked and studied the Arab uprisings for now nearly a decade, is constantly missed in these broader geopolitical discussions we have. And that is this idea that these poorer populations in the Middle East, as they've been left to decay by corrupt leaderships, have themselves decay to the point where no one is educated, where no one is able to articulate. And the reality is, building on Alex's previous point in relation to Ayatollah Sistani, nobody's calling for a religious theocracy. They want transparent civilian democracy. They want a real chance at a transition to democracy that they feel they were denied 16 years ago, or that those in power have taken away from them. And that includes Iran. And I think if it was other actors as well, flying into the green zone for emergency meetings and flying out, there would be a similar type of focus. And you've heard chants in the streets saying, you know, no US, no Iran. I think what's really key about the Iraqi protests, which I have to say I haven't heard in any of the other countries that have experienced uprising of this scale in the last 10 or so years, is the call, we want a country. إحنا نريد وطن. And that is really the key here. It's not about Iran specifically. It's about everybody. It's, you know, everything that has made this situation post-2003 possible, and in many ways for them unlivable. And that is what they're fighting for. And I agree with Alex. I do hope they succeed, or I do hope there's some way in order to achieve that. But it does require political courage from inside. It is going to require, unless the entire system collapses under the weight and the burden of these protests, it is really going to require some political courage from the right actors inside, who can stand up and put their hands up and say, we screwed it up and we have to give it up, and it's done. This is not going away. And how much that becomes a reality is really about how long the street can sustain across the country.
I think we'll have to leave things there for now. But Hafsa, Alex, thank you both for joining the podcast today.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you so much, Alistair. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.